On the 14th of April this year, I started journaling. It was in response to listening to a podcast about the benefits of the practice, how getting thoughts out of your head and down as words on paper, or in my case, into a computer, can create clarity of thought. I've never journaled before or kept a diary of any kind. Leaving a paper trail of my own inane thoughts and feelings had always struck me as a rather pointless and pompous pursuit. Sorry, Samuel Pepys. And yet, here I was. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was decorating the living room listening to a podcast by someone who swears by journaling as a method of developing self-awareness, improving problem-solving creativity, and promoting mindfulness. So I put down the paintbrush, picked up my phone, and opened the Documents app. The first line I ever committed to record was, "Last night must go down as one of the most depressing evenings I've ever had." Reading it back now, only 3 months later, I struggle to identify with the mindset of the person writing those words. They sting a little. I feel rather embarrassed and somewhat shameful about the person I was on that day, just a few short weeks ago. And there are also parts of that 750-word journal entry that upset me, because I also recognise and empathise with that person. I wrote those words when I hit the bottom, and the memory of how I felt on that day is still very raw. "I don't know who I am anymore, and I feel utterly lost," I wrote. "Michelle, who's my wife and was in the kitchen at the time, deserves better than I'm giving her. I'm mediocre." I'm Paul Sutton, and what I realised very shortly after that first journal entry was that I was going through what we commonly refer to as a midlife crisis. And that's what this podcast is all about, the things we go through as midlife men and how to embrace the second half of life with positivity, enjoyment and purpose. The midlife crisis is a firmly established comedy trope. The middle-aged man steeped in resentment and bitterness, and usually with a long-suffering wife and kids, goes out and gets either a Porsche or a 25-year-old girlfriend, or perhaps both, to prove to himself that he's still got it. Middle-aged men are seen as little more than something to be mocked, and stand-ups the world over dig into the midlife crisis pool for routines.
I've got to an age where pretty much anything I do, anything I buy, anything I wear, any activity I take up is considered to be a midlife crisis. It's seen through this weird lens of some desperate attempt to cling to youth. I was on holiday, they were giving windsurfing lessons, right? They were giving windsurfing lessons. In the few seconds I managed to stand on the board, I noticed like half the beach were just shaking their heads. You know. What's he doing? Windsurfing. I think people only be satisfied when I've got a monocle and an ear trumpet.
But behind the stereotype of the middle-aged man, there are some damning statistics. The peak age for divorce rates in the UK is 40 to 49. Although the overall divorce rate has actually fallen over the last 25 years, there are now more divorces from men aged 45 to 49 than in any other age group. In fact, the average age for divorce among men is 46.4. So if you're 46 years, 4 months, 3 weeks and 3 days old, watch out. And yes, I did work that out. More serious than this, though, the rate of male suicide is nearly 4 times that of women. Men aged 45 to 49 have the highest suicide rate of any demographic in England and Wales, closely followed by the 50 to 54 age group. Not so funny now, is it? While the effects of middle age on women are now talked about extensively, the impact on men is largely hidden. The wonderful work of people like Davina McCall and Mariella Frostrup has thankfully brought menopause and perimenopause into the mainstream. And if you check your podcast app, you'll find dozens of shows dedicated to the health and well-being of midlife women. Gabby Logan's The Midpoint is a great starting point. But when it comes specifically to men, there's virtually nothing. I don't know who the male equivalent of Davina McCall is. Ben Fogle, maybe? Ben, if you're listening to this, get in touch. We need to talk. Because men don't discuss anything remotely approaching emotions. If we talk at all, that is. We suffer in silence. We don't talk to our mates about it, if we even have any mates, because that's not what men do. No one wants to be the guy who's always moaning. We don't tell our partners because they've got enough on and we don't want to burden them with our shit. Besides which, we don't even know what to say because we have absolutely no idea whatsoever what's wrong with us. And as a result, we think we're the only one. We think we need to man up and get on with it. Well, I'm calling bullshit on all of it, and that's why Middleman exists. Over the last year or two, I had a growing sense of unease and an awareness that something wasn't right in my life. From the outside, everything looked great. I have an amazing wife, 3 great kids, a dog, a couple of cats, and some chickens. I live in a beautiful 250-year-old former coaching inn in the middle of the Oxfordshire countryside. And I have a successful business, having been an independent digital marketing consultant working with big brands for 10 years. I can work with who I want, when I want, and from where I want. I know how fortunate I am, and from the outside, it all looks pretty bloody awesome. But beneath the surface, I was deeply unhappy, and not very far beneath the surface at that. A few months back, the resentment and frustration I'd been harbouring started to boil over. I started to look around at the very life that I'd carefully designed for myself and think, is this really it? And it dawned on me that I was absolutely miserable. I'd lost interest in my work and I felt completely trapped by the life that I had designed. I felt that I had no sense of purpose other than continuously driving my kids to and from school and sports clubs. I felt unappreciated and isolated, and I had no sense of who I was or what my place in the world was. And as I noted in that first journal entry, I felt utterly lost. But this was all locked inside me, and it manifested as being a grumpy old man with no patience or tolerance or drive. I was a mediocre husband, a mediocre father, and a mediocre consultant. Around this time, I came across the book Rethinking Masculinity by Dan Stanley, and it was as if the lights had been turned on in a very dark room. Dan explained the midlife transition and the midlife crisis in a simple and down-to-earth manner.
It's a natural stage of one's journey. At some point, whether it's like it was in my case, becoming a father for the first time, or some kind of, the phrase I use here, Paul, is life quake, a bereavement of a relative, a breakdown of a marriage that results in divorce. There'll be a moment at some point, usually between I'd suggest 35 and 50, where life really invites us to take a deeper, more informed look at who we are, how we're living, and where we're heading.
Within the first couple of chapters of Dan's book, I suddenly understood what was going on and why I felt the way I did. I felt seen and I felt somewhat reassured. But accepting that I might be having a midlife crisis wasn't easy at first. I wrestled with the fact that nothing specifically had triggered this, that I could be stereotyped so easily, and that, quite honestly, I didn't want to have an affair, and at 52 I felt too old to be buying a Porsche. My reaction probably goes to show the predictable issue that we have with male midlife. I remember working up the courage to talk to my wife about it. We were sat on the sofa one evening and I casually blurted out less than elegantly, "I think I might be having a midlife crisis." That was quickly followed up with, "But I'm not going to buy a sports car or have an affair or anything." Middleman is intended to be the show that I couldn't find when I was desperately looking out for podcasts and advice on midlife for men. You might be listening to this as a man in his late 30s or 40s or early 50s who has the same sense of frustration or resentment or confusion that I did. Or you might be married to a midlife man who is obviously lost in the world but who doesn't know why. It doesn't really matter. I just want Middleman to provide a safe space to listen and to think. The show is going to be divided into 3 main strands. In some shows, like the first 5 or 6, I'm going to be talking to experts in the field of male midlife about some of the issues and symptoms that arise when we reach the midlife transition.
It's a moment of complete lack of knowing what the solution is, and is entirely disabling. So I think what I certainly see in a lot of my clients, and I certainly felt it myself, is just that sense of not being able to do anything. I have no capacity or capabilities to get myself out of this situation. Everything feels too big, too enormous. So is that a crisis of action, a crisis of knowledge? Yeah, I think it's absolutely the right word for it.
In other shows, I'm going to be talking to psychologists, coaches, and wellness experts about the things we can do to make the second half of our lives productive, fulfilling, and joyful.
if you could map out your dream life day, what does that actually look like? If there was no limitations and salary and money wasn't a problem, like what is it that you would be doing? Create that vision and get excited about that vision, because if you don't know where it is that you're going, and importantly, you don't understand why you're going there, you're never going to make that move.
And in the third strand, I'm talking to everyday men and women about their own experiences of midlife, both the challenges and the successes they've had in recentering and realigning themselves.
I think that one of the biggest challenges that people in our life stage face is overcoming that, I could almost call it prejudice, that, that once you pass basically 40 or like sort of 45, that you can no longer get to grips with things that are newer or do something different. And I think that you very much can, because all of our careers and all of our experiences have actually taught us to do that and to lead us to that stage.
There are going to be some very raw and at times uncomfortable conversations. You're going to hear some brutal honesty.
If you came up to me at a wedding or some sort of social event, someone said, "How's your life going?" I would have said, "Oh, it's great. I've got a lovely wife, got 2 lovely daughters, got a nice house, got nice holidays. I've got my partner at a GP practice, and life's going great." And the reality of that was that was really a real lie. Really, I was feeling incredibly low, flat, regular kind of suicidal thoughts.
But over and above that, Middleman will be enlightening and it will give you information. I want to take you with me on my own journey of exploration. The thing is, I firmly believe that knowledge is power. About 20 years ago, I was diagnosed with clinical depression, and this was long before mental health was a thing that people spoke about. But I turned to books to try and discover why I was susceptible to depression, what had caused it, and what I could do about it. That resulted in things like adapting my diet to incorporate foods that might give me a boost, and working on cognitive behavioural therapy. I remember developing a scheme where I would break my weekly ironing chore, ironing, you remember that? Into doing just 3 shirts or 5 t-shirts at a time, so that the mound of ironing I had each week seemed like a manageable task. So yeah, knowledge. When I realised that I might be having a midlife crisis, I tried to dive into books and podcasts to find out more. Except that there was a startling lack of information on this topic for men beyond articles on random websites talking generically about the midlife crisis. My hope is that this podcast goes at least some way towards filling that gap, and I really hope that you find it interesting and insightful. On the next show, we're diving headfirst into midlife for men. With the help of 3 midlife coaches, I'm investigating what midlife actually is, how you can identify if you're in the mindset of a midlife crisis, and how you can start to work your way out of it.
I think for some strange reason, the word middle and middle age has become synonymous with the beginning of the end. And I don't know how we've managed to, over time, define the middle or redefine the middle as the end. Let's go back to, hey, what does the middle mean? You're at halftime. What do we do then? We go back into the locker room. We assess what's happened in the first half of our lives. And we make a plan to come out and play the second half better than the first half.
That show is available right now on your favourite podcast app. You can also contact me and sign up to the Middleman newsletter, which is an article and resources based on the theme of the week's show at middlemanpodcast.com. I'd love to hear from you at any time with your thoughts on the topics we're covering and, if you're willing to share them, your own experiences. Take care, and I'll see you soon.